So, without further ado, we are about to get into uh, Dr. Feelgood.
Dr. Feelgood. Dr. Feelgood. Dr. Feelgood. Dr. Feelgood.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the Dr. Feelgood segment is where we talk to doctors and scientists at the leading edge of cannabis research and treatment. We discuss exciting news from the medical cannabis sector, all things CBD, and also it's where we share inspiring stories from folks whose lives have been greatly improved by medical cannabis. And man, do we have a major player at the forefront of cannabis research for you today. It's an understatement to say that we are beyond honored and privileged to have a distinguished doctor, scientist, and researcher as our very first guest on Relax It's Just Cannabis, the esteemed and brilliant Dr. Daniele Piomelli. Because that's how we do here on Relax It's Just Cannabis, baby. Now, let me just give you a little bit from this brilliant man's background. Now, Dr. Piomelli studied pharmacology and neuroscience with James H. Schwartz and Eric Kandel at Columbia University from 83 to 88, and also with Paul Greengard at the Rockefeller University from 88 to 1990. In 2000, two of his mentors, Kandel and Greengard, were awarded the Nobel Prize for their contributions to physiology and medicine. After working at the INSERM in Paris, France, and at the Neurosciences Institute in San Diego with Nobel laureate Gerald Edelman, Dr. Piomelli joined the University of California, Irvine, where he is now the Louise Turner Arnold Chair in Neurosciences and Distinguished Professor of Anatomy, Neurobiology, Pharmacology, and Biological Chemistry. What in the world is going on? Look at the big brain on Dr. Piomelli. What have I been doing with my life? Goodness. Dr. Piomelli is an author of over 400 peer-reviewed articles in journals such as Nature, Science, Nature Medicine, PNAS, and Nature Neuroscience. And he's also the author of 3 full-length books and 34 patents. He founded the Department of Drug Discovery and Development, D3, at the Italian Institute of Technology in Genoa, Italy, which he directed from 2007 to 2016. He's also responsible for 3 biopharmaceutical startups based on discoveries made in his lab. Dr. Piomelli is the director of UCI's Center for the Study of Cannabis and editor-in-chief of Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research, the first peer-reviewed journal entirely dedicated to the study of cannabis, its derivatives, and their endogenous counterparts in the human body. My goodness. That's how we do you here on Relax It's Just Cannabis. These are the kind of guests we bring you on Relax It's Just Cannabis. It's our very first guest. My goodness, man. Listen, check this interview out. How are you today, Dr. Piomelli?
I'm very well. Thank you for the very nice introduction, Larry.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your what must be an insane schedule at this point. How you doing with all the craziness we're dealing with in the world today?
I'm coping, Larry. I'm coping. But you caught me actually in a day off. I'm taking a couple of days with my daughter. So I'm here in Miami chilling, as she would say, and I'm really glad to. I'm really glad to take some questions from you. Hopefully I'll be able to answer them.
I'm sure you will. Well, thanks again, Dr. Piomelli, for your time. Now, the first question I want to ask you, which is a pretty obvious question that I think most of my audience are most concerned about, is cannabis safe?
Well, that's a very difficult question, the way you put it, because it seems like a simple thing, right?
Right.
But it really isn't, because we all are different. We all have different physiologies. We all have different pathologies. Some of us have problems, others don't. Some have more, some have fewer.
Right.
So it is really hard to give a blanket answer to this.
Right.
I think we need to articulate the question a little bit more. So we need to say, okay, how safe is cannabis compared to something else I would do if cannabis were not around. You see what I'm saying?
I do, and I think I know. I think I know where you're heading with that. Like in comparison to like other drugs or things like alcohol or the vicious opioid situation that we're dealing with right now in the world. Now, I happen to know, or at least I believe. I mean, you're the expert, but from all my experiences in using cannabis and the people I know that have used cannabis, and some people that have had really bad experiences with opioids, I know for a fact that cannabis has to be safer than opioids. Yes.
Oh, that I think is a slam dunk. That is an easy one indeed. But it's also I think all in all safer than certain types of alcohol, certain types of ways of using alcohol. It is certainly safer than other legal substances like tobacco, which now everybody loves to hate, but
Right.
for a very long time, as you know, in this country was the leading source of lung cancer, and still remains a pretty serious problem.
Right.
So if you compare cannabis to other things that people would do, I think cannabis comes out fairly well.
Right.
Also, you need to articulate the question in a slightly different way. Ask it, for example, is it safe for? Is it safe for children? Is it safe for teenagers? Is it safe for mothers who are expecting moms? Is it safe for people above 65? So this is the way I think I can answer it a little bit more judiciously.
Okay.
But I think the way you asked the question was probably directed to your public. I do not know your public, but if your public is adults.
Well, we're definitely, I'm catering, the podcast is catered to mature cannabis enthusiasts. People 50 and over is really my market, and the people that I'm looking to inform about cannabis.
Yeah, well, then an educated, rational use of cannabis, I believe, is certainly safer than anything else that is out there. If you have to use a substance, which not everyone feels like they need to use, but if you are in that the group of the population who feels, for example, that you come back at night after a long day of work, you're stressed out, you need to cut the edge off. I certainly think that cannabis is safer than, say, a couple of shots of a whiskey or some other drink like that. But if we were asking whether, for example, your teenage kids can safely use it, my answer is no. You should be careful about that.
Right.
Because in teenage years, there are a lot of things that are happening in the brain of kids. The brain is maturing. There is a need to actually the brain. I don't know if this is broadly known to your public, but we have our own cannabis. Our brain makes our own cannabis, right?
Right.
It's not the same cannabis, of course. It's not the same molecules.
Mm-hmm.
They're very different in chemical structure, but they are similar in the way they work. And these compounds are really important in development. They're really important, especially in brain development,
mm-hmm.
in young people in the teenage years until you're about 23, 24. When you become a young adult, at that point you become less sensitive to use of cannabis. But in teenage years, I would be really, really careful. I'm not saying, tell your kids that if you smoke pot, they're going to go crazy, because that would be, I think, wrong and would lead to the opposite result of actually having them not trusting you and then use maybe because of that lack of trust. My view would be just like I told my daughter when she was under, in that period of her life. I said, look, honey, if you feel like you have to try it because you want to try it, just be careful and don't do it often. Do it maybe once a week or something like that. If it makes you feel better, but just don't go into a daily use, and most importantly, don't go into multiple daily use, because in that time, as I said before, in that time of your life, that is problematic. Another time where it could be problematic, I'm sorry, let me just finish this thought.
No, go right ahead.
Is an expecting mother. And, we do not know if it's really dangerous. But my view on this, being the father of a young woman, I feel that I would recommend her not to use if she decided to become pregnant, because we don't really know the impact it has on the fetus. There are a bunch of papers out there. There's a lot of confusion. The fact of the matter is that we do not really know. That is the fact.
Right.
And in the absence of knowledge, I would take the road of being careful.
Being careful. Well, that makes absolute sense. And you know, just from a personal experience, Dr. Piomelli, I've used cannabis regularly since, I want to say since 10th grade, which I don't know if that's well, I am proud of it because I think it helped me to cope with a highly traumatic environment. And it again, like for the last 5 years or so, I think I definitely have used cannabis daily in small amounts. I would say it might equate to microdosing compared to what some people's cannabis use is. For instance, if I roll a joint, I mean, that joint will last me all day long, and I might finish that joint by the time I get around to after dinner, which is around 9 o'clock. So I think especially some of the people that I think that listen to this podcast would definitely say that's microdosing. So I don't think I've gone crazy. I think the traumatic environment would have driven me crazy without the use of cannabis, but that's just me.
No, I think, Larry, what you're saying, I hear a lot, and what you're saying makes a whole lot of sense to me. You know, we don't live in a world of absolutes. We don't live in a world where, you are in perfect health, the world around you is wonderful, and then you decide one day to wake up and say, all right, you know what? I'm going to get stoned.
There you go.
This doesn't happen. You know, people are not like that. We're not that kind of animal. We usually have reasons why we do things like that.
Exactly.
And I totally understand that you live in a traumatic and stressful environment, and you need to take the edge off, and you use it the way you're describing it to me. I would honestly not be particularly concerned about you. By the way, you don't sound crazy at all, although I never met you. But you don't sound crazy at all. But I think that one has to be careful with any decision that one makes, not just about cannabis, about anything.
Yeah, just about
gambling,
life in general.
about sex, about
exactly.
life. You know, life is full of problems, right? So, you know, like in everything else, one needs to go there with open eyes and say, okay, I'm doing this. I am monitoring myself. I know that I can live with this without having bad consequences on myself, on my loved ones, on my living.
Exactly.
You know, and as long as you keep a mature outlook and your eyes open on it, Larry, I think, you know, and you talk about it openly. Occasionally, you can talk about it to your physicians if something comes up, some problem in your health, for example. And in the closed doors of the physician's office, you can say, you know, doctor, I've been using cannabis, and see what she or he says. After that, you know, the sad thing, Larry, is that unfortunately our physicians are not very knowledgeable about cannabis.
Exactly.
And that's not their fault. It's the fault, I think, of a system that has made the study of cannabis so complicated.
Right.
But I will still I will keep open that door of communication. Then again, you have to interpret it, you know, with the mind of a mature person, not with the mind of a slave of whatever, you know, people tell you, right? You know, he's a doctor, she's a doctor, not a god.
Exactly.
So you need to interpret that, you know, with your own brain, but keep the line of communication open, because there are some risks, you know, especially if you are above the age of 55. We don't really know how physiology reacts to excessive use. We do not know, for example, how it could impact cardiovascular problems. So these are all things that we all have to be careful about. And being careful is not a bad thing. I think
it's not a bad thing at all. And plus, you know, the old golden rule: everything in moderation. Well, I'll tell you an interesting story, Dr. Piomelli. I'll tell you an interesting story, and what initially made me decide that cannabis was for me as a young adolescent, and growing up and experimenting with alcohol and cannabis, which were the two main psychoactive substances in my environment. I noticed that my group of friends who drank alcohol, I had two groups of friends. One group that drank alcohol and one group that smoked cannabis. I noticed that when I was hanging out with the group that drank alcohol, it always ended in some kind of conflict or violence or trauma. But when I hung out with the friends that smoked cannabis, it was just always fun and laughs and good times. And it was a no-brainer to me. I'm like, if you drink, somebody's going to end up getting in a fight. If you smoke, you might get hungry and laugh a lot.
And by the way, the cops know this so very well that they know that if they have to break in a party where there is a lot of alcohol, they always end up having problems. And if it's some cannabis going on, they know that those problems are not there. Exactly. I hear you, Larry. I absolutely hear you. But it is my duty now to tell you one other thing, that you might have been one of the lucky ones.
Thank God for that.
Because the fact is that, again, during adolescence, there's so much going on in your brain.
Right.
And this is something that people don't appreciate. But our brain stops growing when we are about 25.
Wow.
It's mind-blowing to me.
Wow.
The reason why it's mind-blowing is because as a species, for hundreds of thousands of years, we used to die around 35, 40. So most of our lives back then were basically with a brain that was still
developing. Wow.
And now we have, things have changed. So we now have longer lives, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But those crucial years until you're 25 are still there. Mm-hmm. And, I think that you have to give allowance to the fact that we all are different.
Yes.
Some young people can take it. Some others cannot take it.
Right.
And, I think it's a decision that is hard to make when you're at that age. That's why when you're talking to adults like your audience, you have to use one type of language. When you're talking to adolescents, it's a different type of language. And by that, I don't mean telling them something that is wrong. I think you have to tell them the truth.
Exactly.
But it's not the same message. It's not the same message.
Exactly.
The message that goes to adolescents is be careful.
Yes.
And you heard what I said. I didn't say don't even experiment, because that would be pointless. Who is going to make a teenager do what you want?
Exactly.
Right? I don't know. Do you have kids, Larry?
No, I don't.
Well, as I told you, I have a 26-year-old daughter who is now a young woman, of course, very successful professional. She, as a teenager, she was curious about this thing. So my message to her was exactly what I told you. Be careful, because it can affect your brain.
Exactly.
And now, luckily, she's one of the lucky ones. My family, stable family, decent income, not too much stress beyond the stress of being a teenager, which is per se an extremely stressful situation. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, it was a normal situation. But other people have different life stories. Mm-hmm. So I think we need always to factor in. That's why it's always very hard, Larry, to give a blanket answer to these very important questions that you have started to answer.
Well, I like the way you handled it, Dr. Piomelli. I really like the way you answered that question. That settles it for me. It pretty much, because with all things you need to be careful. There's nothing you should just approach with reckless abandon. You should always do things in a responsible way, and especially when things are new, moderation is the key. But let me ask you a question, Dr. Piomelli. You seem like a brilliant scientist. What was it that drew you to research cannabis?
Well, it was not actually so much cannabis itself. A lot of my colleagues at the time, people I knew, were interested because of what cannabis does to the brain. In my case, actually, was a little bit different. I will tell you, and this is the honest truth. Mm-hmm. I could not use it. I could not use cannabis because I grew up in Italy, mm-hmm. and all cannabis use, which my friends did, was taking hashish, which is the sort of paste that contains high levels of THC, and putting it together with tobacco.
Man, that's like hash is like super cannabis.
Well, I'll tell you, I have an aversion to tobacco. I cannot tolerate tobacco. I cannot smoke it. I cannot even be in a room with someone who smokes it. And so I never really used it. I saw my friends, and they just said, they seemed like having a lot of fun. I was a little jealous of them. but I couldn't because tobacco would have made me vomit instantly.
Right.
So, but what happened is that when I was in my late 20s, quite a while back, but when I was in my late 20s, I was studying, getting my PhD, after my postdoc, I was studying as a young faculty in Paris, France, and I was working on this class of molecules that the brain makes that come from the membrane, which are of the cells, which are all fat-like in nature. I was studying these compounds. I'm pretty happy about that. And then this paper came out saying that cannabis, our brain makes an endogenous cannabinoid, which means a brain-produced cannabis-like molecule, which was called anandamide, which they called anandamide, and saying, okay, look, this is the chemical structure of this particular compound. And the chemical structure of the compound, Larry, was very similar to the chemical structure of the compounds that I was working on. So this is a very nerdy, I have a very nerdy reason to have become interested in cannabinoids. Because of that, I started working on the mechanism through which these compounds are made and destroyed in the brain. And little by little started the field of endocannabinoid research, because endocannabinoid is the name scientists give to the brain's own cannabis-like molecules, endocannabinoids, as in endogenous cannabinoids. And that led me within a few years to study the pharmacology of cannabis proper, and now more recently, the effects of all these different compounds on adolescents, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a little bit of a nerdy, not quite usual path.
Well, I like nerdy. I like nerdy, Dr. Piomelli. That's a good thing.
I'm happy you do, because unfortunately that's what I am.
Yeah, I like it. I do.
I'm a nerd. Anyway, so that's the story. That is the story. That's how I got involved. Now, if your audience is curious and they think that I'm somehow kind of a prude, well, let them know that I actually have tested successfully cannabis several times. And the reason why is because I felt that I could not be possibly studying the compound without having
that's a beautiful
knowledge.
Thing. That's what I'm talking about.
Without any knowledge of it, I felt it was my ethical obligation.
It's your duty
to find out. I say that jokingly, but I actually am that serious, Larry, about it. I am. And I'm glad I did, because I'll tell you, I don't think that scientists sometimes they tend to be a little bit kind of prudish on these matters. But I think the fact is that if you really want to understand, sometimes you need to have a personal perspective. And I felt that it was important for me to have that personal perspective. So I approached it in my usual nerdy way, but I thought it was a very important learning experience for me.
How was your experience?
It was actually, it wasn't just one. Because if you do it only once, you probably you don't get it. So it was on separate occasions. I did it very seriously, and it was very interesting. So first of all, the thing that struck me the most was that it didn't fit with what the literature was saying, in the sense that the major effects that I experienced were related to my sensory experiences. So
now, let me ask you, Dr. Piomelli, did you smoke or did you eat it? How did you consume it?
No, I did have to smoke it, but
Okay.
it was not with tobacco. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for me, as I said. And what I found out that really induced me. This was like 30 years ago. I was just starting working on this, and what I realized is that the things that it did were really quite unique, because you have this enhancement, this almost exaggeration of your sensory experiences. You have the food tastes better, music sounds better.
Sex is better, Dr. Piomelli. Did you get high and have a little lover? Did you do your thing or no?
I don't know what you're talking about, Larry. Unfortunately, I'm not privy to this information. But I'll tell you, I thought it was very, very interesting. Look, if you're you got to understand. If you're a scientist and you think that the brain is fascinating,
Right.
when you see something so simple,
Mm-hmm.
changing the whole functioning of the brain in a way that is not, and that's really unexpected, you get stuck to it. You get
Yes.
you really, and that's why you really got me quote unquote addicted to studying this, because I felt that there was a real story, and with time, actually, to say I found out that my intuition was correct,
Mm-hmm.
because the way. And again, I want to talk about this brain's own cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
It is so interesting what it does. So
Right.
many interesting things, not just in the brain, but also outside the brain, in the rest of the body.
Mm-hmm.
And for us scientists, I have to say, cannabis has opened a window on the brain that was completely unexpected only 20 years ago.
Wow.
We did not absolutely have any idea that there was this system finally regulating all sorts of different stuff. The communication from one cell to the other,
Mm-hmm.
and appetite and pain and
Mm-hmm.
stress. And, I'm also mentioning this because I want to go back quickly to the issue of safety. I want your listeners to appreciate that you treat a system like this with respect.
Yes.
Okay? So that's why I always tell people, don't think it's drinking a glass of water.
No, it's not.
A compound is a substance that has effects. You monitor them.
Yes.
Make sure that you understand them, how they pertain to you.
And another thing,
And
cannabis is so much
right.
more potent today than it was 30 years ago.
Yes, this is something I often hear. I want to push back on this a little bit. And the reason for this is that there is a risk in the fact that the cannabis that you can access, you can buy at a dispensary, can be extremely potent. You can have 80%, 90% THC
Wow.
in an extract. But if you use it properly,
Mm-hmm.
you can control that, because
You can.
people, you don't have to take 10 puffs. You can take a small one.
Exactly.
If your intent, it all depends on what is your intent. If your intent is to be stoned,
Right.
no matter how weak it was, instead of having one joint, you would have three, and then you would be stoned.
Mm-hmm.
The question is not so much how potent is the drug, but rather how much of it you are taking.
Exactly.
And that is, you are in control of that.
And
You are in control
this is why for me, Dr. Piomelli, smoking is the best way. Well, is my preferred way to consume, because the dosage control is so much easier as opposed to consuming an edible and then kind of waiting for surprise of how it's going to affect you. The effects you feel from smoking cannabis are almost felt immediately, and you can much more easily gauge how much you need.
I think you are completely right on this, Larry. A lot of the folks who show up at ER for excessive use of cannabis, and there are quite a few actually,
Mm-hmm.
are folks that are either inexperienced and or folks who have used edibles.
Yes.
Because
yes.
Those are the two critical things. So if you are inexperienced and you want to try, then you have to apply exactly what I said before. Be respectful, be careful, monitor yourself.
Exactly. And I think smoking is much easier to kind of gauge it and kind of creep up on the levels that you're trying to get to, as opposed to consuming an edible and not having any idea how it's going to hit you. Because when it hits you, I'll tell you a story, Dr. Piomelli. Now, like I told you earlier, I've been smoking cannabis since the 10th grade. Maybe about 15 years ago, I was working at a restaurant, and one of my managers gave me a pot brownie. Now, this was a rather small guy. He was maybe 5'5", maybe 145 pounds. He gave me a brownie about 3 inches square, and he said to me, this is what he said. Have you ever eaten weed before? And I said, no, this will be my first time, but I've been smoking since since I was in the 10th grade, so I'm sure I can handle it. And plus, I'm twice your size. Just give me the brownie. Anyway, his instructions were. In the morning with a cup of coffee, cut this brownie into 4 pieces and have just one of the pieces. Finish your cup of coffee, wait about an hour and see how you feel. So I'm like, okay. So before I even got out of his presence, I had already made up my mind that, okay, I'm gonna do half the brownie. This little dude, if he can say a quarter of a brownie, I'm gonna do half. So that next day, with my cup of coffee, of course, I didn't follow his instructions, and I ate half the brownie. Now, coming from smoking cannabis, I was used to the effect being almost immediate. Now, he said that it would be about an hour before I felt it. So I heard him, but I was more used to a different experience. So maybe a half an hour later, I didn't feel anything. So I'm saying, okay, well, maybe I need to eat another piece. So I ate another quarter of the brownie. Now, like I said, Dr. Piomelli, I've been using cannabis since the 10th grade. In about an hour's time, I was so intoxicated. I picked up my whole body was buzzing. I felt like I was standing beside myself, Dr. Piomelli, so much so that I picked up my phone and was about to dial 911.
Yeah. I'm not surprised at all. What you're telling me is a very common story, and it's the reason why people show up at the ER.
Right.
Because they go to a party, they have half a brownie, it doesn't do anything.
They have more.
Eat the other half, and then all of a sudden, they are heading home maybe, 2 hours later.
Yes.
Because, here's the thing.
Yes.
The absorption is very variable.
Oh, my goodness.
If you add a nice fatty meal, then the absorption is fairly quick.
Yes.
If you had little to eat, it takes longer to absorb.
It's insane.
The other thing about eating a brownie or eating just an edible, which actually, by the way, is not that bad if you do it in the proper way.
Exactly. Right. That's true.
Yeah. The problem is that it goes through your liver. And that's the first place where anything we eat goes through the liver. The liver is there to make sure that we don't eat bad stuff. So one thing that it does, it chemically changes chemicals so that they are more easily eliminated by the body, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the functions of the liver.
Mm-hmm.
And this is called metabolism.
Mm-hmm.
So when THC, which is, as you well know, the active principle in cannabis gets to the liver, it becomes something else, something that's called 11-hydroxy-THC.
Mm-hmm.
And that is actually more potent than THC.
Wow.
So
wait a minute, Dr. Piomelli. So if you consume cannabis as an edible, it has a different effect on you physiologically than it does if you smoke it?
Yeah,
wow.
It does. It definitely does. Because there's a lot more of this 11-hydroxy-THC in your blood. And this 11-hydroxy-THC is not equivalent to THC. It's more potent than THC, may be more effective at certain things that THC does. Mm-hmm. And as a result, the type of experience that you have can be very, very different if you take it as an edible than the type of experience you're used to if you're used to take it as, say, through vaping or smoking. That way are pretty much equivalent. Mm-hmm. The substance goes into the lungs, and from the lungs it gets pumped directly into the brain.
Right. So
there is some 11-hydroxy-THC that gets produced, but not as abundantly. Mm-hmm. And here is another fact that is fascinating. You probably know that women and men don't respond the same to cannabis.
I didn't know that.
Well, not all women like cannabis as much as men do. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons is because sometimes they don't have a good reaction to cannabis. And so here is the thing. Women tend to make a lot more 11-hydroxy-THC than men do. And this has been now demonstrated in many, many different studies and many different ways. And I'm not saying that this is the only reason why men and women differ in their mm-hmm. response to cannabis, mm-hmm. but it is certainly one reason. Wow. And again, it tells you how interesting and how complex this substance is.
My goodness. It is. It's just truly amazing to me, and it's about time. So let me ask you this question, Dr. Piomelli. If it wasn't for that Marijuana Tax Act back in the 1930s, we would obviously be a lot further in our understanding of cannabis, especially as a medicinal property.
Oh yeah. Oh, that goes without saying, Larry. I think it was a very bad moment in the history of this country, that the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. And sometimes people fail to appreciate one thing, that there was really no medical reason for that piece of legislation.
Mm-hmm.
Let me give you the background. At the time, cannabis was used medicinally and was sold in stores.
Mm-hmm.
It was sold in pharmacies, and typically it's a tincture. So basically, it would be an edible in a sense. Yeah, you would dilute the tincture in water or something else and drink it, right?
Mm-hmm.
In tea and drink it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was used for pains, for spasms, a few other things like this. Now, was it very effective? No, it was not. It was not very effective,
Mm-hmm.
but it was used and tolerated. 1937 comes, and alcohol had been prohibited for a long time. Then then the prohibition stopped in the 1930s, and so there was this big bureaucracy, this big state bureaucracy that had been put into place to control alcohol, and had to find some occupation. And the way the solution that the federal government at the time decided to use was to actually direct it toward this cannabis, which they didn't call cannabis, by the way. They called marijuana.
Right.
They used the Mexican term,
right,
because it was basically racist. There was a very strong racist component there.
Yes.
Not just against Mexicans, but also against African Americans.
Without a doubt,
and
of course.
Not that that's something that we should be surprised about. But if you read anything, you might have, but if you read anything from those years, is shocking, is mind blowing, how the messaging was so ostensibly false.
Oh my God! It was just propaganda. My thing has always been, and it's just ridiculous. From the little bit of research I've done into cannabis, I know that at some point back in the day with mankind and civilization, cannabis has always been there. So my thing is, like, how is it in 1937 the American government decided that cannabis is no longer legal, and then the propaganda campaign that they went into to prove that, or to at least try to convince the public, a public who has been using cannabis all along. I did some research into how popular cannabis was, and when in the revolutionary days back in the history of America, they mandated that every household in the colony grow 100 plants of cannabis. They used cannabis as you could repay your loans with cannabis, because back then hemp was such an important commodity in the world. They were using it for.
So Larry, let me just, if you don't mind, just to push back a little bit on this, because I don't want you or your listeners to be a little bit confused on this.
Right.
So the type of hemp that was used in the American colonies. Mm-hmm. Was the same hemp that people in Europe had used for many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up, smelling the smell of hemp, because hemp was used to make fabric. Okay,
right.
But that hemp, Larry, did not contain a whole lot of THC.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if you look into the literature, it would say, yeah, well, if you walk in a field of hemp, cannabis hemp, mm-hmm. you can get a headache. If you're a worker, you can get a headache. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't really. And this actually, Larry, this is one of the reasons why we have a problem today, because cannabis was not ever used in Europe or in the American colonies really as a substitute for alcohol. It was used in North Africa as a substitute for alcohol. It was used in Mexico as a substitute for alcohol. And I think we can say now it's a safer substitute for alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't used for its intoxicating properties.
Right.
So when this in the late 1930s, this campaign started, and there were many economic reasons also behind that. And not a historian, so I don't want to go there,
Mm-hmm.
but there were many reasons for that.
Right.
When it started, it was in a sense easy because the American public, the European public, did not know what this thing was.
Right.
And all they had to do is to say, look, black folks, Mexicans, they use it and they become violent.
And it's evil, and they rape our women.
Exactly, they rape our women.
God.
Oh yeah, oh no, that was
God.
actually not. It was not even something they would say like with innuendos. It was actually in. If you look at this amazing 1936
It's
movie
crazy.
called something. I'm
You talking
blanking on
about
the name.
Reefer Madness?
The Reefer Madness. Thank you so much. If you look at the ad, it's like basically makes women have sex with other men and men of other races, quote unquote.
Right.
And it makes men violent. And this movie is atrocious. Of course, it's just a piece of propaganda. So my point is there was no medical reason behind the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937,
Exactly.
and that is what really annoys me. It annoys me because if there had been a medical reason, albeit maybe a wrong one,
Right.
we could, there would be some sense to it. But now, almost 80 years later, we are still suffering from the consequences of the stigma created by the illegality of cannabis that we cannot understand either, Larry, the benefits or the risks. And this is where I keep saying, when you curb research, you don't understand the benefits,
right?
But you don't understand the risks either.
Exactly.
So it is really a lose-lose scenario.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get it. I don't understand why it isn't such a clear thing that, at least for research purposes, the federal government should most definitely remove all limits to the use of cannabis for research purposes and give scientists, give people in the medical field the time, the opportunity to find out what really is going on. Meanwhile, of course, as I said, treating the things with the appropriate caution.
Right.
But the only people really have a hard time are the scientists who can do the work. Mm-hmm. Because if you are living in California, no matter your age, you can get cannabis very, very easily.
Very easily.
Except if you are a scientist, because then, you have to jump through all sorts of hoops.
You're kidding me.
To get the work done.
So the scientific research of cannabis hasn't been freed up, even though it's legal medicinally and recreationally, they still make it difficult for scientists to research it?
Well, don't forget, it's still illegal at the federal level.
Oh,
and federal law
preempts
state law at every level. The federal government sometimes makes the conscious decision not to intervene in state affairs. Mm-hmm. However, it is the law of the country that federal law preempts state law. So in theory, any administration, and some administrations have done it, including administrations you would not expect, mm-hmm. can raid, say, a cannabis dispensary.
Wow.
But I mean, in theory, the feds could raid a cannabis dispensary. There is only one in California or in Colorado or anywhere else where it's illegal. There are 20 states where it's legal.
Right.
I think 18. I don't remember the exact number. But anyway, the point being that it changes every time. But the point being is that the federal don't do it because there is something in the budget that gets renewed, has been renewed, but is about to expire, whereby the federal the FBI mm-hmm. cannot use resources to go against, so to speak, state law
right.
when it comes to cannabis. So if in Alabama they can do it, but they cannot do it in California.
Right.
They cannot use the money. So that's sort of a
Do you see that
It's
changing, Dr.
more.
Piomelli? Do you see us getting to a place where the federal government will loosen the restrictions on cannabis so that medical researchers like yourself can have the freedom to discover the things about cannabis that we need to know?
Well, I'm not privy, unfortunately, that I don't know what the federal government will do in the next year. I know that everything that they're doing is very made complicated by of things. What I do know is that it would be a very bipartisan position to change the laws, because both parties, components of both parties, not everyone in both parties, but components of each of the two parties, for different reasons, want the same. And I happen to think that would be the only rational movement forward, is to lower the barrier for research and make it easier for medical scientists to study cannabis. And I know that there are bills that are being considered currently. Some of them are better than others.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue is that, am I optimistic? Moderately, because there is so much dust that is being raised on this, that I don't think, unfortunately, that our legislators and lawmakers in DC can see through it well. I can tell you that every time I've been there speaking to lawmakers about this, or to their staffers, and that has happened a few times in the past, they lend you an ear, but they really are not very well prepared to understand the science, to understand the problems, and sometimes instead of saying, okay, let me spend a day working on this,
Right, to look into it, right,
to look into it, they rather take a political shortcut and say, okay, this is more expedient, and I'm going to do this instead of doing the right thing.
Right. And then they have their interests, and they have their interests that they're trying to protect. But it just amazes me that the government can be so hardcore against cannabis, knowing that all the negative connotations about cannabis were based on a propaganda and lies. But yet and still today, they still hold fast to those attitudes and trying to keep cannabis illegal. It's just beyond the pale for me. It's beyond frustrating. But thank God for me, I live in the state of California where it's legally, medicinally, and recreationally. But it's a damn shame that doctors and brilliant scientists like you have to go through so many changes just to research something that's been a part of the human experience since the beginning.
Yeah, it is saddening. If you were to visit my lab, I'll show you the steel safe.
Wow.
Inside the locked freezer, inside the locked room, inside the locked building, where I keep the few milligrams of pure THC that we use, when I could walk or drive 5 minutes to a dispensary and take it 1,000 times more and bring it home. And there is no rhyme or reason for that. And it's the one thing that makes me and everyone else, like similarly minded people, really infuriated, because then you have to kind of come to the conclusion that they don't want us to do it. It's not just that, it's just ineptitude, it's incompetence. There is a lot of that, but it looks like someone does not want to
exactly,
know
and that's what I feel it is. It's like there's some powerful entity that has lobbyists powerful enough to keep these lawmakers from doing something that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's just ridiculous what cannabis prohibition has done to American culture, especially the culture in the families and communities of African Americans and Hispanic people. It is absolutely ridiculous. But that government thing is just a rabbit hole, Dr. Piomelli, and we can talk about that for hours. But let me transition a bit and ask you about one of the most popular components of cannabis, CBD. Now, I know people who believe and bought the propaganda about cannabis hook, line, and sinker and still frown upon cannabis, but they will go and get some CBD and use it profusely. What's the now? There seems to be a school of thought that most of the CBD on the market these days is not even effective at treating as a tincture or whatever they're using it for. What are the things we should look for to be sure that the CBD we might purchase or use is actually effective and actually has some kind of effect on us physiologically?
So that is a tough question because there is such a brouhaha on CBD and so much of a hype. And I get the question a lot.
Right.
So putting things in perspective, CBD is now an approved drug in the United States under the name of Epidiolex. It's used for certain forms of epilepsy, childhood epilepsies, in which is moderately effective. It is moderately effective. It has also side effects. And the main side effects it has are related to the fact that just like THC, as I was mentioning before, CBD goes into the liver and is metabolized by the liver. It's converted by the liver in other compounds. That fatigues the liver, tires to read the liver down. And as a result, the liver starts to release some enzymes and things because the cells are damaged. So CBD is not free of problems. If you use it at the high doses that are required for the anti-epileptic effect, so those are the ones that are for which it has been approved in children with certain forms of genetic epilepsy, the risk of a side effect is pretty high. In fact, it was in the trial was very high. Now, there are other potential medical uses for CBD. For example, there are studies that have suggested an effect on anxiety. There are studies that have suggested an effect on psychosis, which is what happens, in folks who suffer from schizophrenia. They have this sort of hallucinations, they have paranoia, and there are some studies indicating that CBD might be effective under those conditions. So when I say studies, please, what I mean is not definitive studies, not conclusive studies. There are good studies out there, but they're not conclusive yet. So anxiety, psychosis, and epilepsy. These are three conditions, with epilepsy being approved, the only one that is approved, three conditions in which CBD might be effective. But it would be effective only if used at very high doses. And what I mean by very high is almost a milligram a day. Sorry, 1 gram a day. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I said 1 gram a day.
Wow.
1 gram a day is, we are talking about a very, very, very large amount.
Yes.
And extremely expensive also. So you will never find if you go online or you go to a dispensary, you will never find a tincture of CBD or an edible of CBD that contains that level of dosing. You will need to probably use an entire bottle to get to 1 gram. Maybe one bottle contains 1 gram or 2 grams, but not much more than that. So there is that. And so, as you said before correctly, if people use it for anxiety, for example, which is a lot of people I know does, they would have to increase the dosing so much that they would incur, more likely than not, would incur in potential issues of liver toxicity.
Right.
But this is something that before the final word is not said yet. The studies to show this have not been done. So take this, what I just said, with a grain of salt. But one thing is for sure, if you take just a few milligrams, 20, 30, 40, 50 milligrams, which is what most people end up taking, you're not going to have any effect that is any of the effects that are touted in the literature, in the scientific literature.
Now, what about people that are using CBD as a topical, like for muscle pain or soreness and stuff like that? Is it effective in that way?
So there is no study showing that for sure. But that's at least it's a safer route of administration, because if you give it locally, CBD won't get absorbed very, very quickly at all. It will eventually get inside, but it will mostly stay at the site of application. And there is decent evidence that has anti-inflammatory properties. I think that studies in this direction are being currently performed, are being done. I'm pretty optimistic that in the next maybe 2 to 3 years, we'll have a final word on some of these things. And, you know, I'm skeptical, that's my job, but I'm also optimistic that some of this will pan out. I certainly hope that some of this will pan out, because if CBD works for something, relieving pain, oh my God, don't we need better pain relievers? Of course we do.
Yes, of course we do.
Of course we do. So I think that is something that would be amazing. Now, I'm not losing my sleep over it, because I don't think that it's going to be a game changer. But if it helps, you know, if it's an incremental improvement, that's still going to be useful. And when you apply topically, it's certainly a lot safer. One thing that you need to consider, this is not so much for the topical aspect, but for more if you take it orally, is that you have to trust what's in the label. If the label says it's 100% CBD, you have to trust the label, for its work.
Right. But
you don't know that for sure, because unfortunately the FDA has very little ability to, or maybe political willingness, I don't know, but certainly they don't have the resources to enforce, to monitor all these various makers, producers.
Right.
So if you prepare CBD from hemp, for example, there is very small amount of it. There's going to be a small amount of THC, which of course, will end up entering your system. There is also not just delta 9 THC, but if you're using hemp, there might be delta 8 THC that will also enter your system. So now here is a problem, is that if you take a drug test and you think you're taking CBD, well, guess what? You are also taking some THC.
Right, and it'll show up
even
in your...
if it does not affect you, if it has no psychological effect, it may show up in a drug test.
Oh, that'd be
so, I mean, there are all sort of different risks and different problems that are associated with this CBD craze. And, I'm not a hype person. I really don't like hypes. Just whenever something is hyped, I immediately become sort of skeptical.
Me too.
Yeah. And I say I'm happy that CBD has been studied.
Right.
But I think, we know that THC works for pain in adults. Let's do some studies on THC as well.
Hello.
And it's so difficult, as I said, that to make it almost impossible.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Well, I'll tell you this. My girlfriend, who frowns on the use of cannabis, swears by CBD. She's a professional athlete, and she swears by CBD. And she uses it topically on her muscles, and she swears by it. She not only swears by it, she recommends it to a lot of the people she works with.
I'm not surprised, because as I said, CBD has some anti-inflammatory properties, and if it works for her, I mean, there is a possibility that if we run a big trial with 200 people and it's placebo-controlled and is appropriately randomized, etc., it will show up that she was right. But the fact that it works for her doesn't mean that it's necessarily a placebo effect. Could be that actually works for her. So I got no problem with that. And, as an athlete, the only thing that she has to be careful about is that some THC is in there and gets into her system, and for some reason she has to take an anti-doping test. It may show up, and then she could be in trouble, because like that Olympic athlete that had exactly the problem not long ago. It's really a risk. So it would be so much better if we had an FDA given the appropriate resources to control the production and the sale of these products, taking samples and making sure that there is THC only in such low amounts that they cannot affect this type of testing. Otherwise, folks like your girlfriend might end up in trouble.
Well, thank God she doesn't have to deal with any of the anti-doping laws. She's She teaches tennis, so thank God
Oh, okay,
so
cool.
she didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. But she swears by it. She recommends it to a lot of her clients, and they swear by it too. And I think it's the funniest thing because, like I said, I've been smoking cannabis all along, and we've been in a
Hmm.
relationship for a pretty long time, and she's always frowned upon it. And then so I just think it's amusing that now when I go to the dispensary, she says, "Can you see if they have some of that Poppers and Barkley oil I like?" And
Well,
I'm like, so this
it is kind of funny, but
it's funny,
I
man. It's
hear
so
you.
funny. It's so
It is.
funny. Just like when I go to parties and I want to say, "Where you going, Larry?" Say, "Oh, I'm going outside to smoke a joint." "Oh, you're gonna go smoke a joint, pothead." And then at the end of the night, they're all out and done, drunk and stupid. And then it's just funny to me the differences in people's attitudes. Again, driven by that intense campaign of propaganda against cannabis. But anyway, Dr. Piomelli, I have one last question for you, and this is just a personal question, something that a personal question of mine, something that I'm interested in. I know sativa and indica. What is ruderalis?
Oh my God, you like tough questions, don't you?
Well,
So I'm not a
I told you I'm a
botanist.
bit of a nerd myself, Dr. Piomelli.
Yeah, no. You're. I'm not a botanist. So what I'm about to say, please take it with a grain of salt. But
Exactly.
the fact is, and I'm gonna say this. The fact is that we as humans have used cannabis for a very, very long time,
Hmm.
either as hemp or as something else, either for food or for
Right,
rope or whatever, right?
right.
So when we use plants, we make them the way we want them to be. All right. So
Hmm.
we make them, we change them, we
Yes.
create cultivars or varieties
Yes.
that have certain properties and not others, right?
Right.
So it is identifying original species of cannabis, such as those you just mentioned, sativa, indica, ruderalis. These are the three main uh, species that were first characterized when scientists looked at the plant in different parts of the world.
Right.
When you try and do this, it's extremely difficult. So one tool that we have that we didn't used to have is genetics.
Hmm.
Before, we used to look at the plant and we said, oh, look, it's got a long stalk and it's got, leaves that look like this, it's got
Right.
the flowers that look like this, it's going to be sativa.
Hmm.
Or it's got these other properties, it's going to be indica.
Indica.
Or these other properties, going to be ruderalis,
Hmm.
right? But these are only external features of the plant.
Oh, okay.
It's not what the plant is, because those
Oh,
external features could depend on the environment the
right.
plant grows in, the
Hmm.
nutrients, the amount of water, the temperature, all these different factors, right? So the genetics, on the other hand, doesn't lie because the genetics is the complement of genes, so the complement of instructions to make the live plant, right?
Hmm.
And when you go and look at the genetics, unless things have changed in the last year or so, the last time I looked into this, it's almost impossible to distinguish between sativa, indica,
And
ruderalis.
ruderalis,
It's
right.
basically impossible. And the reason for that is because we have messed with these plants so much that
Yes.
they are basically one large set of varieties that have a similar genetic composition with some small differences so that certain terpenes are more in a place, certain other terpenes in another. There is more CBD, there is more THC.
Hmm.
All these things are the result of human selection. So the question, unfortunately, you're asking, my answer is that there is there's probably only one species of cannabis
Hmm.
with probably
Right.
thousands of varieties, not just two or three.
Yeah,
So
because I've
cannabis
even noticed that
sativa,
in the short time that cannabis has been legal here in California, in my experiences in dispensaries when I first started to go, I would distinguish that whether or not I wanted indica or sativa. But then one of the bud tenders educated me and told me, he said, actually, most cannabis, almost all cannabis, is hybrid now. It's a little bit of
yes,
both. Yeah.
Yeah, but they use this sort of it's kind of a little bit of a marketing ploy, if I can say that.
Right. That's exactly what they said. They said the same.
Indica is for certain things, sativa is for other things.
Right.
So they use it as a shorthand to say, if you want to achieve this particular purpose, use this one. If you want to achieve that purpose, use that one. Now, I'm not saying that there is no basis for this. What I'm saying is that if there is a basis, it has not been shown yet.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it's cannabis is cannabis is cannabis. Yeah, there are differences in smell. Obviously, there are differences in the amount of terpenes. There are differences in the level of THC. Other cannabinoid metabolites can be different. So all these things can play a role.
Right.
But what drives the pharmacology of cannabis, the way we started this conversation with, so the cannabis that makes you high,
right.
really, the cannabis that gives those expected effects.
Right.
Those are driven by THC.
THC.
If you remove THC, cannabis would be oregano. If you remove THC, cannabis would be oregano. Wow. I mean, honestly, that's what it would be. Have you ever had freshly sort of real oregano?
Probably not. Just the trash they sell you in the supermarket.
Oh no, that's terrible. But if you buy the real thing, and you put it in a bag, as I've done, it smells like pot. It does. It smells like because it has all the terpenes, the lovely, the volatiles, etc. So I mean, I think it would be an interesting pharmacological machine. But the cannabis is just an amazing little sort of chemical industry, if you like. But the fact is that THC is the reason why it's hated by many, loved by many, and illegal, unfortunately, for many. So that's,
and I found it most interesting because before this conversation with you, when I thought about CBD, I thought more medicinal compounds, and when I thought THC, I thought more psychoactive compounds. But it sounds like what you're saying is that we're starting to realize that THC also has some medicinal compounds.
Oh no, absolutely! But make no mistake, THC is actually proven to be a medicinal compound. There is a drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States has been a drug for over 40 years.
Wow.
Since the 1980s, a compound called Marinol, which is now there are now 2 or 3 that there actually have been, and they've been used rarely in the clinic, mostly to treat nausea. And nausea is one of the pharmacological effects of cannabis, the THC in cannabis, that is completely and conclusively demonstrated in scientific literature. THC in cannabis curbs nausea, particularly if you're taking a nasty class of drugs that block cancer growth. These are anti-cancerous drugs, the chemotherapeutics are called. These agents, if you they give you stop your appetite, give you nausea, and there is little as effective as actually cannabis in curbing these side effects. And so it was made into a drug in the 1980s, has been approved, and is used rarely. And the reason why it's used rarely is because it's not because of the stigma, but because of the fact that when you put the THC in a pill, for the reasons we discussed, as an edible, it doesn't work as well as if you inhale it, because the metabolism, the slowness, etc., etc. But it is THC. Larry, THC is known to be also, if you look at the analgesic or anti-pain effects of cannabis, there. I don't want to irritate your girlfriend. I'm sure that she's perfectly fine, but and she must be a very fine person. But no.
Go ahead.
THC is analgesic. It's the analgesic component. But the CBD may very well be anti-inflammatory,
right?
But the analgesic effects of CBD are not very strong, and those of THC are probably better. We have substantial evidence. We don't have conclusive evidence, but we have substantial evidence that cannabis and cannabinoids are effective in treating chronic pain in adults.
Exactly.
These are established scientific facts. But unfortunately, all this gets sort of muddled in a conversation that is anything but clear and anything but scientific, right?
Exactly. Well, one last question, Dr. Piomelli. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. You're our first guest here on Relax It's Just Cannabis, and a most distinguished guest you are. Thank you so much for taking time out of your impossibly busy schedule to take this time to talk with us. So I guess we'll finish on this note. What are you most excited about in your research?
Well, at two levels. First, I would like to see proven conclusively that cannabis works for pain or it doesn't. Mm-hmm. This is something that I think needs to be done, can be done, should be done. Mm-hmm. I am excited at the idea that folks are trying to get it done, and hopefully it will happen in the next couple of years. That's one thing. The other thing is that I'm excited by our understanding of our own brain, our brain's own cannabis, because I think that can lead to also very important changes in the treatment of diseases like depression, anxiety, autism, and things like that. So I'm excited both for what cannabis per se can offer, but also for the insights and potential pharmaceutical development that cannabis can usher through the knowledge that is now producing.
Yes. Okay, then. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Piomelli. Thank you
very welcome. Enjoy the rest of your day now, Larry.
I most certainly will. And you be careful out there, sir, with this crazy stuff we're dealing with. Be careful. And then you enjoy your daughter down in Miami and have a good time. And smoke a joint or something while you're down there, Dr. Piomelli.
I shall not comment on that. Take care now. Bye-bye.
All right, Dr. Piomelli. I'll talk to you soon. Now, wasn't that just awesome? Thank you once again, Dr. Piomelli. We fully appreciate you, good sir. And keep up the good work, please. Cannabis needs you. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's a wrap. Our very first episode of Relax It's Just Cannabis is a full send, baby. Thank you, Jesus. The lit age. We gave you a solid foundation of necessary knowledge about cannabis history that you're going to need to know if you're going to be a true cannabis enthusiast. And that's just the beginning. Check us out next week, where we'll go into our first series entitled The Essentials. Essential accessories for cannabis enthusiasts, things you need to know and have to optimize your cannabis experience. Thanks for checking us out and spending your precious time with us. We fully appreciate you, baby. So until next time, we wish you love, peace, and joy. And don't forget to tell folks, relax. It's just cannabis.